Good morning. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to congratulate, to thank the organizer, to Omer and Ariel, really for this beautiful conference, and I'm very happy to be here. I was asked by Ariel this morning to replace Michael Ebstein, who couldn't attend. So I didn't have any time to prepare anything, but I do want to say something about Professor Israel Levin, Zichrono Livracha. It will take 1 minute. I was a research assistant of Professor Tova Razen and Professor Israel Levin for quite some time. I think 7, 8 years, something like that. We were working on the liturgical poems of Moshe Ibn Ezra. And like once a month, Elisha Barosh, my partner, and I, we went to Israel Levin home, beautiful home, not far from here in Afeka. And together with him, we sat in his office. He was already an old man. And we sat in the office around a round, big Cooper table. And we were reading poetry together and deciphering manuscripts. And it was really a very, very dear experience for me, for us. And we really felt that, like, we're very much grateful for this gift that we have. I will start this session. Yehonatan is ready. Good. So our first speakers will be Yehonatan Vardi and Iyas Nasser from the Hebrew University. I will present both of them now. Dr. Yehonatan Vardi is a senior lecturer in the Department of Hebrew Literature in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research focuses on the Hebrew poetry of Al-Andalus. He published, together with Dr. Michael Rand of Cambridge, the book Diwan Shmuel HaNagid, a Genizah Codex, and is working now on completing a new edition of the entire Diwan of Shmuel HaNagid. Occasionally, he translates Arabic poetry to Hebrew, and he also writes about modern Hebrew literature. Iyas Nasser is a scholar of classical Arabic poetry and literature in the Department of Arabic Language and Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His doctoral dissertation examines various narratives forms in pre and early Islamic love poetry. During his 2 postdoctoral positions at the Freie Universität Berlin and the Hebrew University, he has investigated the appealing effect of love poetry and the rhetorical technique of the extended simile in classical Arabic literature. His studies focus on various themes: pre-Islamic wine poetry, the perception of despair in classical Arabic poetry, modern theories of narratology, and medieval Arabic works of rhetorical criticism. His current research is devoted to the theory of love presented in Kitab al-Zahra, a famous anthology of poetry compiled in the 9th century by Ibn Dawood al-Isfahani. So Yehonatan and Iyas, you're welcome.
Good morning, everyone, teachers and colleagues. Thank you, Ria. Thank you also for the beautiful things you said about Professor Levine, Zichro Livracha. Starts. The great poet, theoretician, and historian of Hebrew Andalusian poetry, Moshe Ibn Ezra, introduced a saucy anecdote in his book Kitab al-Muhadara al-Muzakara, the book on conversation and deliberation, about two other great Hebrew Andalusi poets, Shmuel Nagid and Shlomo Ibn Gabirol. This anecdote relates to Ibn Gabirol's poem Shefat Mizrak, the Goblet Sleep. In what appears to be a wine poem, he describes a winter banquet that contains brilliant figurative descriptions of the goblet, the lightning, and the storm clouds. However, the true purpose of the poem is only revealed in the last line, to mock the most prominent Jewish figure of the generation, the poet, rabbi, and statesman Shmuel Nagid. The magnificent description of the nocturnal tempest ends with a surprising simile. It was called as the poetry of Shmuel Nagid. So it was called as the poetry of Shmuel Nagid, ותפיסתה כמו שהחזיר בו כמו שירת שמואל הקהתי. It is hard to tell whether the satirical poem was meant to be read by Hanagid himself, whereas Hanagid served as a wazir in the Taifa kingdom of Granada. Ibn Gabirol spent most of his life about 700 kilometers away in the kingdom of Saragossa. Perhaps he felt that the distance separating them and the loyalty of his companions would protect him and expected this poem to be a music secret for a select few. But slander tends to spread. The poem reached Shmuel Nagid and prompted such ire on the part of him that Ibn Gabirol was forced to compose a lengthy apologetic poem to him. Apart from these poems, Nagid is mentioned in other works by Gabirol in a very different light. As a young, poor, sick, orphaned poet, Ibn Gabirol wrote several panegyrics in honor of his occasional benefactor, Shmuel Nagid. It makes sense to assume that the panegyrics preceded the satire, which put an end to the relationship between the poets. Thus, it is tempting to inquire why Ibn Gabirol stopped lauding his patron and instead wrote invectives, and what caused this patronage to collapse. One of the most obvious explanations is what Ibn Ezra called Nasser, the hot-tempered soul of Ibn Gabirol. It is easy to imagine how the proud young genius found it difficult to praise others for a living. Since in this particular instance, his patron was also a well-known poet, it is even easier to see why this could have irked Ibn Gabirol, who claimed to be the best poet of all. Thus, a combination of the humiliation of the needy with a Bloomian anxiety of influence festered until it burst out in this satirical poem. However, the shift from praise to satire does not only have inner psychological motivations, but also social ones. It seems that the Jewish intellectual elite of Saragossa competed with the great polymath of Granada, and making fun of him became bon ton. The grammarian Marwan Yonah Ibn Zanah debated philological questions with Hanagid that turned into mudslinging, and Ibn Gabirol's contemporary poet, Moshe Ibn Atakana, introduced his panegyric to the Zanah family with a nasty invective lines aimed at Shmuel Nagid. By composing Shfat Mizrak, the Goblet Sleep, Ibn Gabirol was simply following the local Saragossian trend. The anecdote about Ibn Gabirol's satire of Shmuel Nagid is often quoted since it piques healthy curiosity related to gossip about great poets and intellectuals. But the poem itself apart from its poignant last line, has not received much scholarly attention, despite its superb literary quality. The few literary analyses available are faulty and speculative, and the punchline has never been sufficiently explained within the context of Arabic culture, poetry, and poetics. One obsolete article even suggested the implausible possibility that the term called poetry was not derogatory whatsoever. In fact, the poem itself was never printed accurately. In this talk, we present a new edition of the poem based on a re-examination of the manuscripts. Then we analyze the literary qualities of the poem, and in the second part of the lecture, my friend Dr. Iyas Nasser will present the poem in its Arabic cultural, literary, and generic context. Let's begin by just reading the entire poem in Hebrew in its new corrected edition. I will then read the English translation line by line, not the new beautiful translation of Sandlin, but a more literal translation just to focus on the text, on the Hebrew text. שפת מזרק מנשקת שפתי, כשמש זרחה על כף אמיתי, במימי הגפנים בערה אש, ותאכלני ולא תאכל כשותי, ועוד לא ראתה עין כמראה זכוכית יעשה אדם דמותי, אשר בלט ידבר לי עשישו, חדל טרם יבעתך שעתי, ואיכה תערוך שמש לעוברי, ולי יתרון אלי שמש בצאתי, למען כגבייתה ערומה, והשפיר והצועם כשותי, ואיך תשווה דברי המהולל לאש גזל מעט מתאוותי, שתינוהו והברק מפזז לגרש האפלה מנבטי, יפזר בעדה תרשיש ושוהם, ויפיץ באפשיה שנתי, ויתפאר בפה זהב עלי אב, תלקט שרשרות זהב בביתי, ומימיה כמי שלג שניר או כמו שירת שמואל הקהתי. The first line describes the wine goblet. The lip of the goblet kisses my lip. The sun shines in my companion's palm. The speaker describes himself drinking with a friend. The presence of both friends enabled the poet to focus on two senses simultaneously. While the sensation of one's lips on the cup is compared to a kiss, the sight of the goblet in the other's palm is likened to the sun, which is suggestive of the sparkle of both the cup and the wine that fills it. The water of the vine burns with fire. It consumes me, but not my garment. The second line is based upon what Dan Pagish called aflaa, something like wonderification. That is the realization of a metaphor such that an ordinary object is presented as extraordinary. Wine is conventionally likened to fire in terms of its color, its radiance, and the feeling it causes. Another metaphor, however, presents wine as the water of the vine. So if it is water, how can it burn? Moreover, since the speaker has already drunk the wine and felt it burns, how can it burn him invisibly such that no one else notices that he is on fire? The language of this line refers to the biblical image of the burning bush, and also to the midrashic story about the death of the high priest Aaron, sons Nadav and Avihu, שרפת נשמה וגוף קיים, ותאכל אותם ולא את בגדיהם. The soul burns while the body exists. It consumes them, but not their garments. Never an eye has seen such sight, a glass which creates a man in my own image. The next line deals with a third quality of the goblet. It is made of a glass so fine that it serves as a perfect mirror, reflecting the speaker's exact image. With wine slowly speaks to me, saying, enough, lest my fire will terrify you. The fourth line contains a twist. The cup itself addresses the speaker and orders him to stop making similes. The cup is nothing like the sun, the kiss, the mirror, or the fire. Where else in the realm of symbols and metaphors, the fire is as gentle as in the story of the burning bush. It burns yet does not consume. Here, the cup's fire now threatens to actually burn the speaker. Enough, it says, lest Yevaetcha she'eti, my fire will terrify you, a quote from Job, which according to some commentaries means, I will burn you. Here, Ibn Gabirol uses a typical rhetorical device known as the difference within the symbol. A good example is saying that a woman is radiant like the sun, but that she is better because she never sheds. However, this rhetorical device is dramatized surprisingly in the poem, since the cup itself refuses to accept symbols about it. Apparently, this is a poetic crisis. The progression of the poem is forced to halt by an overwhelming question. Does language have the power to describe reality? Can words capture the world through symbols? In fact, this is not an anti-symbol at all, but rather a hyper-symbol, not nothing like the sun, the way Shakespeare dismissed the conventional Petrarchan tradition of symbols, but rather too much like the sun, or even better than the sun. The basic structure of the symbol, tenor, vehicle, and ground for comparison is not violated. On the contrary, the ground is such a dominant characteristic of the tenor that the vehicle can only launch the comparison, not to exhaust it. In the following lines, let's look at the reasons the cup invokes to reject the symbols of the sun and the fire. How can you compare the sun to my own light, since I am better than her as I rise? For her body is exposed naked, while I wear sapphire and lapis lazuli. You can never be sure of the translation of the names of precious stones. At any rate, when the sun rises, it sheds its nightgown and appears in the sky naked. By the way, this astronomical image differs from the rabbinic image of Galgal Chama Yesh Lo Nartik, the wheel of the sun as a ship. Wine, however, arises bedecked in the most luxurious garment. It is poured into a bright goblet with its ornamentation of precious stones. The wine continues to brag in the seventh verse. ואיך תשווה דברי המהולל לאש, גזל מעט בתאוותי. The text in the printed editions of the song is different, לאיש גזל and not לאש גזל. How can you compare my essence to a man who stole my passion? However, this version is undoubtedly wrong. And the word le'if, which survives in only one manuscript, should be punctuated differently to read le'ef, fire, and not le'if, to man. Thus, the rejected symbol is now the fire. Here, Ibn Gabirol, the Neoplatonist philosopher, interferes with the work of Ibn Gabirol, the poet, and offers him an image of a Platonic emanation. Fire is indeed white hot, but it is only because it takes part in the ideal heat of the wine. The emanation is a theft, as gezal. A remnant of the Promethean myth of the stolen fire survives in this verse, which presents the ideal, poor, unstolen fire, not as a chemical reaction, but rather as the result of passion. The heat of the wine derives from its inner passion, whereas fire is merely its reflection, its shadow. This is the end of the first part of the poem, dedicated to the warm light of the wine, the sun, and the fire. The second part of the poem depicts its negative picture, presenting winter, the darkness of night, and the rainstorm. The light of the section, of the other section, is only found in the cold flashes of the lightning. Thus, by now, all the major themes integrated into the surprising punchline about the cold poetry of a Nagid come to the fore. On the one hand, contrast between hot and cold, and on the other hand, the preoccupation with meta-poetic questions about the power of language and of poetry, finding the right symbol, originality, who possesses the real heat and who steals it, and passion. All these motives are used to create the fantastic descriptions of the wine cup, but they also imply that it is not an innocent wine poem, but rather a poem whose aim is to debase a rival poet. So here is the cold section of the poem. We drank it while the lightning danced to expel the darkness from my home. It scatters beryl and emeralds beyond it, and scatters my sleep to the ends of the earth. The flashes of lightning are likened to precious stones, which suddenly appear within the darkness, causing the speaker, perhaps wine caused him to doze off, to wake up. Now, when he is back to his senses, it is the lightning, not the wine, which starts to brag. It boasts with its golden mouth to the cloud that collects golden necklaces in my house. The rain falls, apparently not exactly into the house, but to an open court or a patio. Being lit by the lightning, the raindrops seem like gold necklaces. The image reverses the direction of movement. The rain seems to go up, and the cloud seems to collect the drops of gold. Now we get to the punchline. With water, or in other manuscripts, or its chill is like the snow, in other manuscripts, the snow water, the melting snow of Mount Shenir, Har Hermon, or like the poetry of Shmuel the Levite, Shmuel HaKehati. The meta-poetic discussion is back, once again raising the question of the right simile. Shall I compare a winter night? What can it be likened to snow? Or perhaps to the ice-cold poetry of Shmuel HaMegid? The epithet HaKehati, the Levite, is certainly not coincidental or destined only for the needs of the rhyme. HaMegid himself was extremely proud of his pedigree as a Levi, the tribe of the poets who sang in the temple in Jerusalem. His tribal origin is mentioned many times in his own poems and in panegyrics written in his praise, revealing a belief that this ancestry genetically guarantees a special poetic talent. Therefore, Ibn Gabirol stresses this ancestry to sharpen and distinct. Even though he belongs to the tribe of the poets, his poetry is as cold as ice. Thus, the lip of the goblet's lip, is a punchline poem which takes a surprising twist in its final verse. The satirical remark at the end attracts the attention of readers and scholars. As I hope to have shown, this is a brilliant poem right from the start. The descriptions of the wine and the storm are magnificent as they should be to make the final satirical line so surprising and overwhelming. However, we can still read this poem as a whole, since the clash between the so-called cold poet and his rival is already implied in the motifs used to describe the wine and the storm. And now to the interesting parts. Yes.
Okay. Is it about sharing? Is it about sharing? Okay. It's a great pleasure to be here with this wonderful audience. And I'm grateful, very grateful to Omer and Ariel for the invitation. And I'm also very grateful for all the people who organized this wonderful conference. It's also my pleasure to be with or beside my close friend, Yehonatan, and it was a wonderful presentation of the poem. So Ibn Gabirol's reference to Shmuel Hanagid's work as cold poetry raises a number of points regarding coldness in classical Arabic literature. Given the particular climate of the Arabian Peninsula, it is no wonder that classical Arab poets refer to coldness in various contexts. Cold has positive connotation in certain expressions, such as Aishun Barid, pleasant life, and Qarir al-Ain, a calm and relaxed man whose eyes are cool. We may also note that coldness is prominent in classical love poetry, which refers appreciatively to a cold mouth or cold kiss, Thaghr Barid. Many classical poets evoke the beloved planting a kiss upon her lover, thus cooling his ardor with her cold saliva. In the opening of a polythematic qasida, the noted Abbasid poet Al-Buhturi says to his beloved, as you can see in paragraph 1, and also ماذا يضرك لو بردت حرارة بين الحشا برضاب ثغر بارد? What harm can come to you if you cool my inner heat with your cold saliva? However, in contrast to these positive associations, there are also several expressions in classical Arabic literature that illustrate a negative perception of coldness. Cold poetry, shi'run barid, is a literary term used by classical Arab poets and critics alike to signify a bad, silly, artless, unimpressive, and uncreative poetry. Abu Hilal al-Askari, a critic who died at the beginning of the 11th century, refers to poetry and prose alike when he distinguishes between outstanding lively discourse, nadirul kalam, and cold discourse, baridul kalam, which is unimpressive or defective. According to al-Askari's argument, a literary text is based on wording, lafz, and meaning or idea, ma'na. Since ideas are known to everyone and are expected to be logical and correct, it follows that wording is the most significant aspect of a literary text. Its value, he says, can be assessed in terms of excellent diction, jawdatul lafz, and sound formulation, sihhatul sabki wa tarkib. Moreover, al-Askari argues that verses which have a correct idea, al-ma'na sawab, but cold wording, are distasteful and blameworthy. He says, as you can see in paragraph 2 of the handout, وإذا كان المعنى صوابا واللفظ باردا وفاترا والفاتر شر من البارد كان مستهجنا ملفوظا ومذموما مردودا. When the idea is correct and the wording is cold and tepid, and the tepid is worse than the cold, the verse is distasteful, rejected, blameworthy, and unacceptable. In addition to the discussion of cold wording, Al-Askari cites several verses of cold poetry, Al-Barid min al-Shi'r, referring in particular to the Abbasid poet Abu al-Atahiya. in paragraph 3 of the handout. والبارد من الشعر وقول أبي العتاهية مات والله سعيد بن وهبي رحم الله سعيد بن وهبي يا أبا عثمان أبكيت عيني يا أبا عثمان أبكيت قلبي. والبارد في شعر أبي العتاهية كثير، والشعر كلام منسوج ولفظ منظوم، وأحسنه ما تلاءم نسجه ولم يسخف، وحسن لفظه ولم يهجن. Among the examples of cold poetry is the saying of Abu al-Atahiya, by God, Sa'id ibn Wahb has died. May God's mercy be upon Sa'id ibn Wahb. O Abu Uthman, you make my eyes to weep. O Abu Uthman, you cause pain to my heart. Cold verses in Abu al-Atahiya's poetry are many. Poetry is a woven or composed speech and versified wording. The best of it is illustrated by coherent verses devoid of silliness, which have beautiful and not abominable expressions. Al-Askari clearly disapproves of the verses of Abu al-Atahiya because their content is expressed by cold and unbeautiful wording and trivial formulation. Moreover, a close study of Al-Askari's work reveals that the term barid is not limited to wording or poetry. He employs the term called meaning, ma'na barid, which denotes a banal, unoriginal, and unimpressive idea or meaning. Al-Askari quotes the argument of an anonymous scholar who refers to the poetry of Abu Nuwas, a famous Abbasid poet who died in the first decade of the 9th century. In paragraph 4 of the handout. وسمعت بعض العلماء يقول ومن المعاني الباردة قول أبي نواس في صفة البازي في هامة علياء تهدي من صرى كعطفة الجيم بكف أعصرة، فهذا جيد مليح مستوفى. ثم قال يقول من فيها بعقل فكر لو زادها عينا إلى فاء ورى فاتصلت بالجيم صار جعفرا، فمن يجهل أن الجيم إذا أضيف إليها العين والفاء والراء تصير جعفرا. I have heard a scholar saying among the unimpressive ideas are the verses of Abu Nuwas who describes a falcon. He has a high head followed by a beak bent like the letter Jim written by a left-handed man. The anonymous scholar comments, this is a good, beautiful, and perfect verse. Then Abu Nuwas said, one who thinks about it says, if he adds to it, to the bent Jim, the letters Ayn, Fa, and Ra being connected to the Jim, he will have the name Ja'far. Here, the anonymous scholar comments again, who does not know that if we add Ayn, Fa, and Ra to Jim, it becomes Ja'far. Al-Askari argues that the image described in the first verse is true or correct, sawab, but the superfluous comment that Abu Nuwas adds in the next 3 lines makes it defective. Without this addition, his simile would be more approvable, ajwad, and elegant, arshaq. Al-Askari's comment shows that the term ma'na barid denotes a hackneyed and superfluous idea which fails to impress us as it is devoid of creativity and originality. To the best of our knowledge, me and Yehonatan, the only classical Arabic scholar to have formulated a clear definition of cold poetry is Usama ibn Muqidh, a scholar who lived in the 12th century. His treatise on poetic art, Kitab al-Badi'a, has a chapter on outstanding poetry and unimpressive poetry, Babun Nadir wal Barid. He describes these as two contrasting kinds of poetry. As he says in paragraph 5, اعلم أن الشعر النادر هو الذي يستفز القلب ويحمي المزاج في استحسانه والبارد بضد ذلك. You should know that outstanding nadir poetry excites the heart and inflames the temperament in response to its beauty. Cold poetry, barid, is the opposite. Ibn Munqidh's definition makes it plain that the term shi'r barid refers to an inferior poetry, one that does not excite or impress its audience through diction or content as poetry should. In classical Arabic literature, the term called poetry is often found in invective poetry, hija, and pointed jokes, as in one anecdote about the Abbasid poet Abu Hifan, who lived in the 9th century, as you can see in paragraph 6 of the handout. وقال أحمد بن أبي طاهر في الفتح بن خاقان وقد اعتل من حرارة ما دواء الأمير فتح بن خاقان سوى شعر أهل هذا الزمان ودواء الأمير أن ينشدوه بعد ما قاله أبو هفان. When the governor Al-Fatih ibn Khaqan was sick with fever, the poet Ahmad ibn Abi Tahir said, there is no medication for Fatih ibn Khaqan except the poetry of contemporary poets. The medication of the governor is a piece of Abu Hifan's poetry recited to him, to cool him, yeah? In light of the balance of cold poetry as a motif in invective poetry, Ibn Gabirol must have been fully aware of the strong insult implied in his reference to Shmu al-Hanagid. He employs a conventional description that disparages Shmu al-Hanagid as a poet and labels his poetry as inferior. Moreover, in making the sudden transition from a description of the storm to cold poetry, Ibn Gabirol is not only adopting the well-known derisive term, but he is also employing a literary device called istitrad, digression, which was frequently used in invective poetry. It is characterized by an unexpected deviation from the main subject to a satirical remark. Of the many examples of digression, the most frequently cited is a poem by the poet Abu Tammam, who satirizes a man called Uthman ibn Idris. In paragraph 7 of the handout, I will not read the whole poem, but in the first 3 lines or verses, the poet describes a swift horse, and in the last verse, he says, أيقنت إن لم تثبت أن حافره من صخر تدمر أو من وجه عثمان. You would feel sure if it had not been proven already that its hoof consists of rock from Tadmur or of the face of Uthman. The poet attaches much importance to the description of a swift horse, a celebrated theme in classical Arabic poetry. The last verse indicates that the composition, which seems to be a descriptive poem, wasf, is in fact an invective poem, hija, against an Abbasid patron called Uthman ibn Idris. Abu Tammam compares the hard hoof of the horse to Uthman's face so as to describe the man as insolent. Like the Hebrew expression az banim or kashe banim, the Arabic expression sulbul wajh, literally hard face, refers to a rude, insolent, and shameless person. According to one tradition, Abu Tammam coined a term for this figure of poetry, calling it the digressing poem, al-mustatrad. He even explained it to his pupil, al-Puhturi, as you can see in paragraph 8. وقال لي ما هذا من الشعر قلت لا أدري. قال هذا المستطرد، أو قال الاستطراد. قلت وما معنى ذلك؟ قال يري أنه يصف الفرس ويريد هجاء عثمان. Then Abu Tammam asked, what kind of poetry is this? I do not know. He said, this is al-mustatrad, or he said al-istitrad. I said, and what does that mean? He said, it looks as if it wants to describe the horse, while in fact it intends to deride Uthman. The two poems by Abu Tammam and Ibn Gabirol reflect a significant common feature, a deceptive introduction which paves the way for a startling satirical statement. It should be noted that both introductions have appealing poetic motifs. In Abu Tammam's poem, it is the vivid description of a horse, while Ibn Gabirol's poem opens with verses on wine and the depiction of a storm. It is not surprising that Ibn Izra, in his work Al-Muhadara wal-Mudhakara, refers to Ibn Gabirol's poem as an example of good transition, حسن التخلص, and not digression, istitrad. The term takhallus is notably used by classical Arabic scholars to denote a transition from one thematic section to another in the pre-Islamic polythematic poem, the Qasida. As a rule, the Qasida consists of three parts: the amatory verses, Nasib, the desert journey, Rahil, and the concluding main theme. Ibn Izra's reference to Ibn Gabirol's poem in the chapter titled حسن الابتداء وحسن التخلص, good beginning and good transition, illustrates his perception of the linkage between the parts of the poem. In addition to using the term that is specific to the polythematic qasida, he describes the connection between its parts. As he said in paragraph 9, هذان البابان جمعت بينهما لتقاربهما، فلنقل أن منهم من استحسن تشبيب القصائد بأمور خارجة عن مقاصدهم، ثم تخلصوا إلى ذلك المقصد من مديح أو ذم أو إلى غيرهما من الوجوه بعد الإطالة. I have combined the two chapters of good beginning and good transition, since they are related to each other. Now, some of them, the Arab poets, approve of beginning their qasidas by means of an amatory prelude, tashbib, with themes extraneous to their purposes, maqasid. Then, after some length, they make a transition to that purpose, be it praise or blame or whatever other type. Ibn Izra discusses transition according to the work حلية المحاضرة by Al-Hatimi, a scholar who lived in the 10th century. Al-Hatimi uses several expressions to describe a good transition, such as بارع التخلص, التخلص and حسن التخلص. He also discusses several qasidas that have a good transition to praise, madh, or invective, hija. Ibn Izra thus adopts the term حسن التخلص in reference to Ibn Gabirol's good transition. He describes the poet's technique as follows in the same paragraph 9. وقد تخلص أيضا تخلصا لطيفا من وصف ليلة ظلماء وسحابة باردة إلى ذم شعر. He made a subtle transition from a description of dark night and cold cloud to a criticism of Shmuel Hanagid's poetry. Ibn Izra is clearly aware of the close correspondence between cold cloud and the cold poetry of Shmuel Hanagid. It is thanks to this correspondence that Ibn Gabirol achieves the effect of his concluding satirical remark. To conclude, the discussion of cold poetry in classical Arabic criticism shows that the expression used by Ibn Gabirol to describe Hanagid's poetry is highly insulting. His poetry is artless, uncreative, unoriginal, and unimpressive. It is the opposite of excellent or exceptional poetry, شعر نادر, which has impressive content, beautiful wording, and sound formulation. The digression or good transition in Ibn Gabirol's poem not only highlights his satirical remark, but also presents him as a talented poet himself, unlike Shmuel Hanagid. Ibn Gabirol's striking descriptions of wine, storm, lightning, clouds, and coldness illustrate his poetic skill and his ability to create a coherent, impressive poem in sharp contrast to the work of Shmuel Hanagid. Thank you.
Thank you, Yehonatan. Thank you, Iyas, for this beautiful talk. Our next speaker, José Martinez Delgado. The question will be at the end of the session. José Martinez Delgado is no longer associate professor, but a professor, Mazal Tov, at the Department of Semitic Studies in the Faculty of Humanities of the University of Granada, where he began to teach classical Hebrew grammar in 2005. His research is focused on the grammatical and lexicographical Judeo-Arabic production and the linguistic thinking of the Jews of Al-Andalus. Among his recent publications highlight Risalat al-Tanbin by Ibn Janach, an edition, translation, and study. It was published in Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam in 2016, or fragments of Shlomo ben Mubarak's Kitab el-Taisir in the Taylor Schechter collection, was published in Geniza Kedem in 2015. Fragment of Judeo-Arabic treatise on Andalus Hebrew metrics, Ilm al-Arud. It was published in Journal of Semitic Studies in 2015, and an anonymous book of Hebrew verbs in Judeo-Arabic, was published in 2014. So, José, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. תודה רבה להזמנה, to the organizers, to my friends and my student from Granada, that is here. Thank you for leaving the Ulpan today and come to hear me again. And I'm really sorry about what will happen now, because I know that to talk about metrics is not an easy task, and nobody loves. And actually, it's really difficult to find even the name of the matters in the new edition of the poetry. Nobody wants to deal with this. And and I understand why, because I think that we are wrong when we deal with these poems. And I will try to show you some examples of how we should understand this poetry in its own context, its Arabic context. You can read always in the books that this metric was adapted. There was not an adaptation. It's just Arabic metrics in Hebrew, as I will try to show you. When I began to study the metrics, because I study metrics in Cairo, Arabic metrics, ilm al-arud, and then I realized that there's nothing to do with the Hebrew metrics. So I was trying to find this adaptation. And when I began even to study the Arabic metrics, I found that even the Arabs has never studied the metrics. They describe the metrics. And I find that in different books on metrics, among the centuries, we can find two different currents, maximalist and minimalist. The difference that you can find between these books is the number of units that can comprise a metrical foot, even the number of the feet that comprise the systems, and authors say that they are 8, others that they are 10, and even the number of meters, the 15 classical meters, 16 meters, and al-muhmal. So it's not clear even for the Arabs. Nobody deals with the metrics. I'm from Cordoba, so I will use our book, Ibn Abdel-Rabi here at Al-Farid. And he says he's a minimalist, and he said that we only have 4 units, that they are Sabah Hafif, Sabah Thakil, Watij Mahmou, and Watij Mahfrouk. But there are other authors, later authors, that they follow a maximalist current, and they also talk about the Fasila Sughra and Fasila Kubra. According to the minimalists, this is just the shift of the two later units. What happened in Al-Andalus? Or the books say that Dunash ben Labrat adapted the metrics and the figures and motifs of the Arab poetry. I not agree with this, because you can find all these motifs already, and this use of social use of the poetry, even in Menachem and Saruk. So I think that what Dunas Ben Labrat do is just to adapt the metrics. This happened in Cordoba in 958. We can date it from the poem that he devoted to Hasda ibn Shaprut. When the queen Tota from Navarra arrived to Cordoba, that it was in 958. We understand that in this poetry, we only have 2 units. We see that we have 4 or 6 units. And they always tell us that in Hebrew, we have only 2 units, Yatet and Tenua. So today we understand that we have Sabah Hafif and Watij Mahmou in Hebrew. Where is this coming from? This is coming from Abraham ibn Ezra and Moshe Kinghi, that they need to adapt these metrics for non-Arab speaking people from Romans. So they cannot understand, okay, they cannot feel the nuances and the different shapes of the methods. So they made this adaptation. Then the European authors say that the Arabic metrics is only just an adaptation of Greek classical poetry. And they use the short and long, the macron and the micron, that you can find even in the handout that we get yesterday from Professor Ross Brown. This is absolutely wrong also. And then I talk about Israel, but, I mean, the Israeli scholar, because David Jelin, כשחוכתה, אבל עדיין לא הקים את המדינה, אבל בשבילי. As Jelin and Jeffrey Sherman make some kind of mix of all these theories, and this is what we are using today. What's happening with these trends? That we have to eliminate the sheba under the guttural, the compound sheba, the chatefin. We have to delete it in order to scan the poem. we have also a matter that it doesn't exist in Arabic. It's a mixed form that is Ashalem be'asoer. And of course, we cannot count the succession of two open short syllables in these poems. This is the main difference between our system and the Hebrew system and the Arab system. I found in Firkovich collection, I already edited and translated into Spanish 5 years ago, this manual on Hebrew metrics. You can see the circles. This is El-Sadi, Amaher. And this book, I don't know the author, I don't know the time. I guess that it was writing in such Andalusian environment and in the 11th century. That's all that I can say about this book, about its content. It's maximalist. It defends the existence of Watid Mafruk in Hebrew. In cases, Watid Mafruk means something like this, long and short, that you can find in form like Jebk. So it's mean that this Latu Sheba has to sound, Yebka, following the trends of the time in the medieval pronunciation. The same for the Hashka. And he said that it's the same in Beche. And this segolate name has to be scanned this way. Beche. With this premise, I began to re-understand the Hebrew metrics. And then I find that we have the Sabbath Thakil, that in Hebrew cannot be in isolation, but integrate into the Fasilas Sugras we will see now. And the Sabbath Thakil, and this is the important one for us, we have to understand that when we have something like that, Ma'aseh or Ya'amod, both of them are what we call today short vowels. This is not a long, short, long. This is short, short, long. Okay? Fa'ilun. Where this is coming from? I think that they are taking this from the biblical Hebrew. Because when we find something like Va'ani, the original of Va'ani is Ve'ani. And the first Sheba takes the vowel of the Hatef, as happened in Ka'asher. It's not Ka'asher, it's Ke'asher, but it's taking the vowel. So we have two Shebas here. So this is the second. I find this in medieval Hebrew grammarians. Even Janah defends the existence of this. And Joseph Kingi in Sefer HaSikanon also say that they are two short vowels following in Hebrew. So this discovery was really important for me because it was the confirmation that I was not crazy. Or if I'm crazy, there is other crazies as me. And they are important people, Joseph Kingi and Ibn Janah. I'm as crazy as Ibn Janah, I'm happy, I can be crazy. So I propose a new way to scan the poem now. We have to forget the open, the long, the short. We have to forget this and to talk about al-harf, al-muharrik wal-sakin, the vowels and the kiyastem. And then we can understand this poetry, at least its metrics. So the letters in this composition can be vocalized with any of the 7 Tiberian vowels. The Kameh, the Hatef, Tzeret, Segol, Chirech, Cholem, Shurech, the Kibbutz. With mobile Sheba at the beginning, and with compound Sheba, the 3 compound Sheba. And they are kiesten when they have no one of these, but a kiesten Sheba. And of course, the lengthening letters, Aleph, Baf, Yod, and He, when it's in the final position. In this way, if we use this, Hebrew tolerates all the metrical syllables that we can find in Arabic poetry. It's easy. This is another fragment from of the same book, but it's coming from the Genisa Research Unit from Cambridge. So we have to read the Hebrew this way. we have to scan olam, olam, olam. This is the same. This is the problem in Hebrew, that 3 forms are allowed. And this is something that Hajjus says. The 3 of them are correct. This is not like in Arabic that is fixed. So if we have for Sabah Hafif, or what you call tenua, we have this in Af, Pat, Te. There's no difference between these vowels. If we need a Sabah Thakil, we need first a Fasila. Then the Watid Machmu is what you know as Jatet, Kevar, Bena, Bene, Upo, Ufo, the Watid Mafruh, you can find, for example, I'm taking the example that he take in the book, in this manual, Abraham Shmor Lahemeth. So you have to scan this, Abraham She Mor Lahemeth. This way I have the Maf'ulatu Musta'afin. This way I can understand that I have the Maf'alatu that is, there's no evidence today in Hebrew metrics of the system of this kind of points. And then in Hash, in Jek, Jekka, Hashke or Hashka, and Behe are Fi'ilun. They are also Watid Mafruk. As for Fasila Sugra, we can find, we need this. So we find this in Ja'amud, like in Maaseh. And the Fasila Kubra, no, all the grammarians agrees. But Ibn Janah says, Ibn Janah is not something, agrees that he find it in form like Leshahata, Yemashashu, Kafi Maroth. And many of these cases are coming actually from Aleppo Codex. If you go to other readings, they have not the compound Sheba. So it's quite complicated to find a Fasila Kubra. I don't accept Fasila Sugra. I never found it. I scanned many of the poems that I've had access to, and I never found Fasila Kubra. But he said that this is 6, okay? But it's not in the poetry. So these are the food, the minimalist, the 8, not the 10, and we have to use this food, this feed, sorry, not the feed that we find in the book of Yelin, for example, Mefa'alim, Nifa'alim. There's nothing like that in Hebrew metrics. We have Fa'ulun, Fa'ilun, Mafa'ilun, Fa'ilatun, Musta'afilun, Mufa'alatun, Mutafa'ilun, Maf'ulatun. And then the examples, you have the Mora, Watet, Sabab, and then Yehuda, it has to be scanned this way. Okay, the wow is just a lengthening letter. Yadecha has to be Yadecha. V'yashviya, you can see all the feet that you have in Arabic scanning Hebrew. And then we can go to the poem with a new perspective. The feet, as you know, if you study Arut sometime, undergo other modifications that are called sikhafat. This is the staff feet, and it doesn't affect to the matter. I saw many of them yesterday in the poem that Professor Ross Brand sent, and today I say also some modification of this kind, but this doesn't affect to the matter, and it's not important for us. And it's really complicated. It's all the catalog of the, this is a science, so it's not so easy. What happened with the contemporary editions, that all these modifications are ignored in the scansion method using contemporary editions, if they are scanned, producing a series of lessons that affect both the metrical system and the morphology of Hebrew, and that are attributed to the poets, and the poets never did it. Most notably, the elimination of the 3 types of compound Sheba when they appear under a guttural, and the invention of mixed meters like the well-known Asalem Be'ashoer. Let's see an example. We have here 2 difficult meters, Al-Kamil or Rayas. Al-Kamil is the foot mutafa'ilun 6 times. it can be modified by a modification known as idmar. And then I drop this vowel and I put a sheva. And this began mutfa'ilun, that in metric is mustahafilun. I can apply this in all the poem. If I do that 6 times, it should be mustahafilun 6 times. And then it can be confused with the rayas that has the same sequence. So how can I distinguish these matters? Because if I'm using al-kamil al-mudmar, that this modification, once, at least once, in all the point, the original fit has to appear. At least once. Let's see. שמש כחתם יעטה סוד אור מחודך נאצל ולא נעדר. What's happened here? This is the addition. Why they are keeping the hatef here and they are dropping the hatef here? What's the pattern? Because I cannot see. And this is the metrical pattern that the author gives us, the editor gives us. And this is the discussion that I propose. And so is שמש כחה, תן יעטה סוטור, מהודך נאצל ולא נעדר. נשמע משהו כזה. מוסתעפילון, מופתעילון, פעילון, מוסתעפילון, מותפעילון. So this is al-kamil. It's not השלם בהשוער. It's סתם השלם. לא סוער. Another famous matter, aroch, al-tawil. It can also, this is the complete form of the matter, but we can modify the first fit with the harm, that it consists the elimination of the first letter of each, at the beginning of each mystic. So what was faulun now is ulum, because I dropped this. And it began fi'ilun. This fi'ilun, you can find, it was outside with the coffee. כתב בסתיו בידף מטרף וברביבף ובעד ברקף המאירים בחף עבף. זה יפה מאוד. It's really from Granada. So we have here again the aroch, but modificate at this place. They drop the short vowel of the beginning of the matter. This harm can be affected by another modification, and then it's a double modification that is capped. When I apply the harm, I can apply also the capped. And then I have the sequence long, short. And this is known as therm. And this is what we find in another poem by Ibn Gabirol. This is really famous. כל בעלי השיר חרדו לעומתו, אף יעטו בושת כולם בגם הרפה. We can find that if we scan this as I propose, we can find this modification at the beginning of each mystic. فعيله. I know this is really hard, so and I need to scan the points and to make some exercise. We have no time for this. This is another famous poem, also devoted to Shmuel Anagit. מסוד כמו שחר עולה ונשקפת העיר כאור חמה ברא מאוד יפה. That Shirman said that this is al-basit, המתפשט, but sometimes changed to tawil, trying to sell us that Ibn Gabirol was a bigger poet that can't change a matter. No, poets don't do things like that. Even Gabirol did once. But no, it's not usual. They are really strict with the metrics, and they are not too. So what we have here is only a tawil, aroch, but using the harm. But it's really interesting because I saw that the harm has to be always at the beginning of the hemistich, and he's using here at the beginning of the sequence 4 times, and he only can use it twice, not 4 times. But this is something that is connected to the musamma, the sayel and the muwashah, and this is another communication. Okay, this is a transition. I think that here he's trying to impress to Shmuel Anagid. No, it's a kasida that is not. It's a hybrid kasida between kasida and sayel. But you can see here the down. You have the complete form of the matter, and then you have the modifications. And I found this poem by Ibn Gabirol in the Geniza in Cambridge. This was a noun. It's amazing because in the other side is the famous poem by the wife, by Lady Ben Labrat. That I don't know how many people deal with this manuscript because it's the only one written in Hebrew by a woman in the 10th century. But nobody see the other side of the manuscript, the other side of the moon. And in the other side, we have a poem. We have 2 poems by Ibn Gabirol. This one is famous, but nobody. I was like 1 month in Cambridge looking at all the edition, all the books, because I cannot believe that in this manuscript that was so handled, nobody deals with this poem. The copy is not good. We know already for the copy of Lady Ben Labrat poem. So I have to reconstruct the poem. And I use this technique, and this was the result. The first line is what we find in the manuscript. The second one is my reconstruction. The third is the scansion. And the third is how this song. And you can find also that he's using again, the matter is the amaher, the sari, but this the darb is mafulun, but the arut is faulun. This is something that is also not tested in the new editions of Hebrew metrics. So I'm trying now. We will not read the poem. It's Geula לשבת בבוקר, ממש קצר ויפה מאוד. מרפא ארוכך, יש לחבש, עברי, סברי. יש כמה, קודם כל, הוא של שלמה, כי הוא חותם את זה, שם, שלמה, זה לא אומר שום דבר. But we find neologism like this one, Hadridi, a typical thing that only Ibn Gabirol can say. We have here the semichut. It's broken by the poem, by the verb. It's also typical in him, and many other features that for me is clear that this is a composition by Ibn Gabirol. So, as a conclusion, I have to say that this scansion, I'm not telling you the truth. I'm not here to this and to say that everything is wrong, and that would no. I'm just saying that this scansion allows poet to reproduce all the classical methods in Hebrew, with all their modification and rhythms. We don't need to scan different things. No, it's not Greek. It's not nif'alim, mefu'alim. No. We don't need anything like that. Just to apply the arut, and then we get all the picture. And this is, of course, a maximalist approach that goes again. What, for example, the disciple, the Talmidei Menachem Ben Saruk says, that you can find also in Yehuda Halevi Al-Kusari, the same premises. This is, I know that what I'm presenting here is against this theoretical, but all the poetry is also against this theoretical point of view from the radical people that they don't accept the adaptation. Because I don't see here an adaptation, I just see a use of the Arabic metrics in Hebrew. Well, that's all that I want to show you today in a nutshell, because this is really complicated and I will need more explanation. Thank you very much for your attention and your passion.
Thank you very much, José, for this overwhelming paper. It had to, I think I needed to sink a little bit before I can see how to use it. So thank you very much. So now we have time for a few questions. Ken, Yehonatan, Iyas. Those of you in Zoom, just raise your hand, and if you want to ask anything, raise your hand and we'll see it. Like, raise your hand virtually. Yeah?
Thank you very much. That was absolutely splendid. And I mean, I have a million questions and thoughts, but I'll be very brief. Just a remark to Yehonatan and Iyas. I think regarding the Gabirol poem, that figure of the Kehati figures prominently in the apology poem, right? That Gabirol had to write to Hanagid. So I think it's interesting to see the afterlife of that poem and not just where it came from. Throughout Kum Hazman, he keeps saying, "Ata Levi, ve'ashevet shelcha, ve'banecha, ve'bnei banecha," and so on and so on. So it may be that he realized that he insulted him in more way than one. So that's a thought. Pepe, thank you very much. It's it's a bit mind blowing. I have one small question. Do you think that the new understanding has anything to bear on the mishkalim that we know that were unique for Hebrew poetry? I'm thinking of what's called mishkal hatnuot that Yehonatan has examined, and also what we call mishkal havarati in the piyutim.
Mishkal hatnuot, Jelin already detect that this is the original mutadarak, the 16th method. It's not by Al-Khalil. And as for when I deal with these premises, I wrote a paper, it was in Spanish, about these two premises, how many systems we have. And I find that we have the classical system, like this one that I described, and another one that was not classic, but it's not syllabic and it's not pre-Roman or something like that, like they try to sell us, that they are abaharot. I never found something like that. For me, it's the same, just that sometimes, while the secular poetry is really close to metrical and really respectful with the metricus, the religious poetry isn't. So I think that this is because of the public, because the religious poetry was for everybody, while the secular poetry was for the chasa, only for the elite, not for the common people. So I think that this is the reason that will explain us. Because actually, even yesterday, they say that Ibn Gabirol has no idea of Arab. For this reason, he cannot scan the poems. So I think that this is the reason, the public, but we don't need to see two different models, because we have also political, there's political nuances in Spain, in this kind of theoretical premises. When you say that that the Jews from Spain keep something different from the Roman time or from the Christian time before the Arab. Let's see, this is the Reconquista conception. So, and this is already over. The politics wants to keep about this. The Arab was an invasion, was some kind of cancer. Al-Andalus was some kind of cancer in Spain until today. A few days ago, the president of Madrid said something like that. that there was a stop in our culture, 8 centuries of stopping. So I don't accept this syllabic Roman system in Hebrew. What I see is always the same. It's a classical Arabic matters that can be a scam for people who know how to read this. Another one more popular that just has the sound, but I don't think that we have 2 different systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also. 2 questions. One, a brief one for the recently minted professor. Congratulations.
This was unexpected. I hope that nobody will ask about metrics. Okay.
No, believe me, it's nothing technical, because it would take a tremendous amount of effort, I think, to really grasp everything that you've laid out for us. But is there a clear example, you think, where we've just gotten a poem wrong in terms of the meaning of a poem because the scansion was wrong?
No.
No, okay.
No, it doesn't affect to the meaning. It doesn't affect to what they do, for example. It's just something formal. My goal is to help the editors to make the edition as close as possible to the original form of the poem as these poets conceive these compositions. But I think that this not affect to the meaning. Maybe one dagesh, but this is something that dagesh is important. It's not the same milah that milah, but nobody say here milah. So,
and then my broader question for the other 2 speakers, this is also really fascinating. I'm wondering if we can use this as an opportunity to expand a bit on how we understand the place of invective in the poet-patron relationship. And I think this is something that's been reread somewhat recently with respect to Arabic literature. The assumption was always, and if I think of, let's say, Yahalom's conclusions about the Tahkamoni, where there are these examples wherein the same person is praised in one poem and then lampooned with invective in another, the assumption is always the person was praised first, and then when the person stopped giving money, they received invective. What you're suggesting to me, is that perhaps there's actually space within the patronage relationship for more invective that doesn't destroy the relationship, but actually allows the relationship to perpetuate, where the poet has a certain amount of power in that relationship. But writing invective in and of itself does not cause the relationship to collapse. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that, because it's something been on my mind. So.
Well, thank you for your question. Actually, it depends and it is related to the classical Arabic critics. The one that we can deal with his work. Actually, there are several genres in classical Arabic poetry, and to be precise, in pre-Islamic poetry. Among these genres are the invective, the praise, the descriptive, and the love poetry. The polythematic qasida, the polythematic poem in pre-Islamic poetry was the most important poetic form, and the poet starts the poem with amatory verses called nasib. It was many scholars think that this amatory prelude is intended to attract the audience. Then he proceeds to the second section, which is a description of his mount or his camel or the desert journey. Then in the concluding part, which was the main part, the main purpose of the qasida, al-gharad, it is praise of himself or of his tribe or of some patron. But the last chapter is not limited to this genre. It's also can be descriptive, also a historical theme about a battle between his tribe and another tribe, the poet extols his tribal men. And another prominent genre in this concluding section is the invective. So he can attack the enemy of his tribe. This poetic form undergoes several transformations during the time, in the beginning of the Islam, then in the Umayyad poetry, then in the Abbasid poetry, then in the Andalusian poetry. And the invective was a very important genre. It was forbidden, al-hija, in Islam, and some poets were put it in the prison for their invective poetry. But at the same time, the most dominant genre in the Islam was the praise or the panegyrical qasida. So the two genres were very important and dominant genres through the history.
I want to add to your question that headings we have in classical books differ between the Hiza and the Itab, right? So Itab is when there is some problem in the relationship, but it doesn't go to the end. So Hiza perhaps either stops the relation or being written after the relation has already been stopped. So there is a possibility to say something about your patron before reaching the end of the scale. You have the possibility of Aitab, of reproaching. And even between Shmuel Nagid and Ibn Gabirol, there is this poem, Shemuel at Kiramati. It's a short poem, 4 lines, just saying, don't disappoint me. So perhaps, I don't know, he sent something to Shmuel Nagid. You don't really know how he actually sent his panegyric to Nagid. There was hundreds of kilometers between them. There was some kind of mail services. I don't know how. Probably didn't receive what he expected to get and sent this Itab, this admonishing poem, where the relationship put in end because he stopped paying. Perhaps, I don't know, but I think there are more into it. You mentioned the psychological elements, the humiliation of being in need, the anxiety of influence, and another thing that I wrote about, the separate article, the bon ton of Saragossa against Shmuel Nagid.
Ibn Khaldun. Khaldun.
He has several of these Itab poems also, right. And they're identified by Anne Brenner. I don't know if you've seen, but she wrote about that subject. Yeah.
I think that the most interesting thing in Ibn Gabirol poem, and I'm saying like as a poet, that I think that he started the poem from the last line. Then he make a deceptive introduction. It's like to make a snare for someone. You make first the snare, then you make all or prepare the whole circumstances which paves the way for the snare.
We have the time for one last question. José, please.
Just one remark. I love this poem because it's a really difficult poem. The other people wants to be criticism in this poem, but I think that the first 7 verses, I think you know more than me in these topics. I just deal with the metrics, not with the content. But I always say that the one who is talking is the mountain. This mountain. And I will explain you how. When there is a verse by Federico Garcia Lorca, I cannot translate it, but it's something like, I will translate it into Hebrew. קשה לשמש לאסוף את גרנדה. קשה לאור, סליחה, קשה לאור לאסוף את גרנדה. וזה נכון. When the night arrives, the mountain is so high that you can see it's night, but you can see the sun already in the mountain. So I think that this was, he says in the verse 8 and 9, and I think that this is the call that he was referring to. So he's saying that your poetry is like this, very intense poetry. No, this is very intense. During the night. But they think that nobody understands this. And they think that this is called poetry, but it's not called poetry, it's the beauty, because we have to understand the environment of the poet. Where Ibn Gabirol saw never something like that in Spain, because there's nothing like this. It's like in Israel, no? When you go to the Hermon, no? And the Hermon is full of snow, no? It's for you something you say, so this is so beautiful, no? Because we come from dry environments. So I think that honestly, it's not a girl, it's not a woman, it's just a mountain talking, and you should maybe take in mind this also, this view. Try to be positive with the author also, because it's, I don't. Yeah.
I think
yeah. He tried.
Examples of cult poetry as a derogatory term, and there are many more.
There are a lot of examples which are so similar to this comparison in the poetics books of Ibn al-Mu'taz, of Kitab al-Sana'atayn of al-Askari, of Kitab al-Badi' ibn al-Muqidh, and I couldn't bring these examples which really can be so similar, not only in the content, but also in the order that the poet describes or compares the coldness of someone poetry to a cold water. So it's a very, very invective and satirical remark, which is so conventional in classical Arabic criticism. And it is not also limited to poetry, it's also in the proverb, Ilm al-Amthal or Kutub al-Amthal, and also in several examples in the Umayyad, in the Abbasid, and also in the Andalusian. So I think that's very, very satirical poem.
Jose, you also need to remember that Ibn Gabirol had to apologize for this poem.
And the most important idea that Ibn Izra himself states that this is a invective poetry. So there is another example.
Ibn Gabirol was a special man. Typical Spanish Don Quixote. And you should take in context this picture and this feature that happened there, because this is a beautiful. I will love if someone said that my books are as cold as this. This is beautiful. I mean, of course, you have a context when you have
the last.
Just taking account that maybe he was trying to turn.
Yeah.
And he was misunderstood until today.
In the last, in my last research about Ibn al-Rumi, an Abbasid poetry or an Abbasid poet, he describes a lot his technique, that he opens his qasidas with love poetry or with some statements about wine poetry, and then suddenly he proceeds to invective poetry. So he said, I start the qasida with love to attract the audience. It's very, very interesting case and technique. So we will talk about this in details on our common article, I think.
Thank you very much.
תודה רבה, thank you very much, it was a beautiful session, thank you.